Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the first shots of the American Civil War. Now, if you look at any history book, you will see that the first shots of the Civil War were fired in April of 1861 at Fort Sumter. There's a little bit more to this story that doesn't get talked about a lot. Now, I like to always go back to original sources. This is the 1861 report of the Select Committee of Five in the House of Representatives, published at the end of the Buchanan administration. Let me show you the title page here. You can maybe see it. Let me hold it here for a moment. You will see in here there's awful lot of stuff written about what was going on. And of course, dealing with South Carolina, dealing with seceding states, losing armories, watching all the forts vanish, all the seaports vanish. You have to understand something that people don't realize today, that the South had far more seaports than the North. And in those days, the way money was made was through duties, through tariffs, and that was mainly through the seaports. And so a vast majority of monies made by the federal government have been lost. There was one or two forts just hanging on. One was Fort Sumter. And of course, that was in South Carolina. President James Buchanan sent a ship to provision the fort. It was called the Star of the West. The ship went down to Fort Sumter, and the batteries in South Carolina fired on the ship, hitting the ship and damaging it. This is truly the first shot fired. Now that ship limped back to port. There was a big article in Harpers Weekly. There was a lot of chitter-chatter going on in the House of Representatives. There was a lot of letters going back and forth between South Carolina and the Executive Mansion. The thing is that in Harper's Weekly, there is a quote from South Carolina. They said they fired upon the ship, and if they see another ship coming to provision Fort Sumter, they will look upon it as an act of war. That is in black and white. Now, of course, Lincoln becomes president, and he has to deal with the situation. He is very aware of the Star of the East. He is very aware that the South has already fired upon a federal ship. And he realizes that if he sends a ship to Fort Sumter, which of course he will, and he said he's just bringing provisions to feed hungry men. Now, we know that isn't true. There was a lot of munitions in that ship as well. South Carolina wasn't fooled by that either. And here's the interesting point. Lincoln wanted the South to shoot again so he could start a war. Simple as that. Lincoln wanted the war to start. Now, the thing is that Lincoln had no idea what he was letting out of the box here. If he could have seen 1865, the end of the Civil War, I doubt he would have done what he did. He refused to meet with peace commissioners. He refused to meet with anyone. He was basically working very hard to get a war started. And so he sent several ships to Fort Sumter. But not only that, he sent a telegram to South Carolina, a telegraph message stating that he was doing so. Now, he knew that they would react as they announced they would react in Harpers Weekly. He knew they would look upon Lincoln's action as an act of war. And therefore, as soon as they became aware of the ships coming down, they started to fire on Fort Sumter. So I kind of look at the firing of the Star of the West as the first shot of the Civil War, because it was the emphasis on how everything would start afterwards. The Star of the West and the firing upon it by the South was the kindling to get everything started. And Lincoln, of course, knew all about it. And as I said, he had a war to start. He wanted to start a war. He wanted to get this over with. He had no intentions about slavery. That was not even in his mind at that point. He was basically going to solve the situation and restore the Union. But when he let the genie out of the bottle, it became a rancid, awful mess. Far worse than anyone could have ever thought in 1861. And as I said, if Lincoln could have seen, February of 1865 in April of 1861, I would doubt that his actions would have been the same. Because we're going to deal with a war that was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Nearly 700,000 men would be killed. Well over 1 million, perhaps 2, were wounded in many different ways. Maybe you could say there was more than that wounded, not only physically but psychologically. And it all started with starting the firing at Fort Sumter by sending the ships, which was the second shot of the Civil War. The first shot was the firing at the Star of the West.